I remember the flash through the kitchen window. Not the sound, first the light. White enough to burn through closed eyelids, bright enough that for a second I thought the sun had fallen into the backyard. I was holding a coffee cup, cheap ceramic, chipped at the rim. The kind of detail that shouldn't matter, but when everything else gets stripped away, you hold on to the small things. The shape of the handle, the warmth against my palm. The coffee was terrible, instant crystals that never quite dissolved, but it was hot and it was mine, and those were the things that mattered on a Tuesday morning in October. The light turned the kitchen white, then yellow, then something closer to orange, like the air itself was catching fire. I dropped the cup. I don't remember the sound of it breaking, but I remember watching it fall. I remember thinking, with perfect clarity and perfect stupidity, that I should have held on tighter, that Margie would be upset about the mess. Then the windows exploded inward, and the world became noise. I don't know how long I was on the floor. Long enough for the ringing in my ears to sharpen into something like silence. Long enough for the heat to settle into a weight that pressed against my skin. I stood up in a kitchen full of broken glass and overturned chairs and sunlight that came through the window frames at the wrong angle, too bright, too diffuse, like the sky had been replaced with something that only looked like sky. My hands were bleeding. Small cuts, nothing deep. I picked glass out of my palms and dropped the pieces onto the linoleum, and they made tiny clicking sounds that seemed louder than they should have been. Margie was supposed to be at the store. Tuesday morning, she always went to the store. I tried to remember if I'd heard the car leave. I tried to remember if I'd said goodbye. The front door was open. Not blown open, just open, like someone had walked out and forgotten to close it behind them. I stepped through it and onto the porch, and that's when I understood that the kitchen hadn't been the problem. The neighborhood was on fire. Not all of it, patches. The Hendersons' place across the street was intact except for the windows, but the Kowalskis' next door was just gone, replaced by a crater that still smoked at the edges. Cars had been flipped onto their roofs or shoved into front yards. Trees were burning without being consumed, their branches outlined in flame that didn't spread and didn't go out. People were screaming somewhere, not close, far enough away that the sound felt thin, like it was coming through water. I walked down the porch steps. My legs were working. That seemed important. I wasn't burned. I wasn't bleeding except for the small cuts on my hands. I was standing in the middle of the street in my undershirt and work pants, and everything around me was ending, and I was fine. That didn't seem right. I walked toward the Kowalskis' crater because I didn't know what else to do. The asphalt was hot enough that I could feel it through my shoes. The air tasted like copper and burning plastic. When I got close enough to see into the hole, I stopped walking. There was nothing at the bottom, just scorched dirt and twisted metal and something that might have been part of a water heater. No people, no bodies, just absence. I stood there until the heat became unbearable. Then I turned around and walked back toward my house. Margie's car was in the driveway. She hadn't left. I found her in the bathroom. She'd been running a bath. The water was still in the tub, cloudy and gray, and she was lying next to it with her head against the tile. Her eyes were open. There wasn't any blood. She just looked surprised. I knelt down next to her and put my hand on her shoulder, and she was still warm, and I said her name, and she didn't answer, and I said it again, and the sound of my voice in that small room was the worst thing I'd ever heard. I don't know how long I stayed there. Long enough for the water in the tub to stop steaming, long enough for the light from the window to change color, shifting from white to amber to something closer to red. When I finally stood up, my knees cracked. I was thirsty. I was so thirsty, I could barely swallow. I went to the kitchen and turned on the tap and nothing came out. I tried the other faucets, nothing. I opened the refrigerator and it was dark inside and starting to warm, and I took out a carton of milk and drank from it directly, and it was already beginning to sour, but I didn't care. Then I went outside because I couldn't stay in the house anymore. The fires were smaller now, dying down or burning out, I couldn't tell which. The sky had turned a color I didn't have a name for, gray-green, bruised, like an old injury. Ash was falling, not heavy, just a constant drift of white flakes that settled on my shoulders and stuck to my skin. I walked down the middle of the street because there was no reason not to. No cars were coming. No one was outside except for the bodies, and they weren't moving. I passed Mrs. Chen's house and saw her sitting on her front steps with her head in her hands. I started to call out to her, then realized she wasn't moving. I got closer and saw the burns that had taken the skin off one side of her face, and I stopped calling out. At the end of the block, someone was walking toward me. A man, older, maybe 60, wearing a postal uniform. He was limping, favoring his left leg, and when he got close enough, I saw that his hair had been burned away on one side. His scalp was red and weeping. He looked at me and said, "Do you know what happened?" I said, "No." He nodded like that made sense. Then he said, "I can't find my truck." I didn't know what to say to that. He waited for an answer anyway, standing there in the middle of the street with ash falling around him, and when I didn't give him one, he nodded again and kept walking. I watched him go until he turned the corner and disappeared. Then I walked back to my house and sat on the porch and waited for someone to come and tell me what to do. No one came. The sky got darker. Not night dark, something else. A thickness in the air that absorbed light instead of letting it through. I could still see, but everything looked flat, two-dimensional, like a photograph of itself. I was still thirsty. My mouth felt like it was coated in dust. I went inside and drank the rest of the milk, and then I ate a can of peaches because they were wet and sweet, and I didn't have to think about them. Then I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the broken glass on the floor and tried to decide what to do about Margie. I couldn't leave her in the bathroom. I couldn't bury her. The ground was too hard, and I didn't have the tools. I settled on wrapping her in sheets and moving her to the bedroom. It took longer than it should have. She was heavier than I expected, or I was weaker, or both. When I finally got her onto the bed, I covered her face because I couldn't stand to see her eyes anymore. Then I closed the door, and I didn't go back in. The next few days are hard to piece together. I know I stayed in the house. I know I rationed the food in the pantry, eating one can at a time, drinking whatever I could find. The water never came back on. The electricity stayed off. I used the toilet once, and then stopped when I realized it wouldn't flush. I slept in the living room with the curtains drawn because I didn't want to see outside, and I didn't want to smell the bedroom. On the 4th day, or maybe the 5th, I wasn't counting anymore, I started to feel sick. It wasn't sudden. It crept in like the change in the sky, so gradual I didn't notice until it was already there. A heaviness in my chest. A tightness in my throat. My skin felt hot and dry, and when I touched my face, my fingers came away slick with something that wasn't quite sweat. I thought I was dying. I lay on the couch and waited for it to get worse, and it did, but not in the way I expected. The fever climbed, my head pounded, my stomach cramped, and I vomited until there was nothing left, and then I vomited bile, and then I dry heaved until my ribs ached. My skin started to peel. Not like a sunburn, deeper, taking whole patches of tissue with it. I scratched at my arms without meaning to, and the skin came away in strips, and underneath was something raw and red and glistening. I should have died. I didn't. The fever broke on the 7th day. I woke up on the floor, covered in my own filth, and I was still breathing. I stood up. My legs shook, but they held. I walked to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. The face that looked back wasn't mine. The skin was wrong, mottled, discolored, pulled tight in some places and sagging in others. My hair had started to fall out in clumps. My eyes looked sunken, the whites yellowed and bloodshot. I opened my mouth and saw that my gums had receded, making my teeth look too long. I touched my face, and the skin felt like leather, dry, rough, dead. I stood there for a long time, staring at the stranger in the mirror, and then I turned away because I couldn't look anymore. That's when I knew I wasn't going to die. That's when I knew dying would have been easier. I left the house on the 9th day. I didn't plan to. I just ran out of food and couldn't stand the smell anymore, and when I opened the front door, the air outside seemed cleaner, even though it wasn't. The neighborhood was quieter now. The fires had burned out. The bodies had stopped moving, not that they'd been moving before, but there's a difference between a body that's fresh and a body that's been rotting for over a week. The smell was everywhere. Sweet and thick and cloying, the kind of smell that gets into your mouth and stays there. I walked toward the main road because it seemed like the thing to do. I passed houses with their doors hanging open and cars with their hoods popped and yards full of debris I couldn't identify. I saw a dog lying in the street, bloated and stiff. I saw a child's bike with the front wheel bent at an impossible angle. I didn't see any living people. At the corner of Maple and Fifth, I found a grocery store. The windows were broken and the shelves were half empty, but there was still food. Canned goods, mostly, some dry pasta. A few bottles of water that hadn't been looted yet. I filled a bag and I left, and I didn't look at the bodies near the register. On the way back, I saw someone else. A woman, younger than me, maybe 30. She was standing in the middle of the street, just standing there, and when she turned to look at me, I saw that her face was like mine, ruined, peeling. Wrong. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then she said, "You too?" I nodded. She laughed. It was a brittle, broken sound. Then she said, "I thought I was the only one." I said, "You're not." She looked at me like she wanted to say something else, but then her expression changed. She took a step back. "Your face," she said. I said, "Yours too." She shook her head. "You should cover it. People they don't like looking at it." Then she turned and walked away. I went home and found a scarf and wrapped it around my face and told myself it was to keep the ash out of my lungs. The weeks blurred together. I scavenged. I ate. I slept when I could and stayed quiet when I couldn't. I saw others like me, people with skin that had turned to rot, and we avoided each other like mirrors we didn't want to look into. I saw people who weren't like me, people whose skin was still smooth and whole, and they crossed the street when they saw me coming. No one spoke to me unless they had to. I started covering more of myself, long sleeves, gloves, a hat pulled low, the scarf over my face. I told myself it was practical. Protection from the dust, from the sun, from the cold that came when the sky finally cleared and the seasons remembered how to change. But I knew what it really was. I was hiding. Not from the world. From myself. Time moved strangely after that. Days became weeks, became months, and I stopped counting because it didn't matter anymore. The calendar had ended with the flash of light through the kitchen window. Everything after was just survival. I found a place in an old apartment building on the east side, 3rd floor, corner unit. The door still locked and the windows still had glass. It was better than the house, smaller, easier to heat, easier to forget. I lined the walls with cans and bottles. I boarded up the windows on the ground floor. I set traps for rats because they were easier to catch than anything else, and I'd stopped being picky about what I ate. I was alive. That was supposed to be enough. It wasn't. The first time someone called me a ghoul, I didn't understand. It was in the market, a makeshift thing set up in the shell of an old warehouse, run by people who still had skin that looked like skin. I was trading scrap for clean water, keeping my head down, minding my business. The man behind the counter looked at me and said, "You ghouls are all the same." I said, "What?" He sneered. "You heard me." I didn't argue. I took my water and I left. Later, I heard the word again. And again. Ghoul. Like it was a species instead of a condition. Like we were something other than people who'd been unlucky enough to survive. I stopped trying to correct them. The thing about being a ghoul, and I still hate that word, even now, even after all this time, is that it changes the way people see you before you even open your mouth. They don't look at your eyes, they look at your skin. They don't listen to your words. They hear your voice, rough and rasping from a throat that doesn't work the way it used to, and they decide you're not worth listening to. I learned to keep my answers short, to avoid eye contact, to leave quickly and quietly and without making anyone uncomfortable. I learned that uncomfortable meant dangerous. The second year was harder than the first, not because of the scarcity. I'd gotten good at scavenging, at finding food where others didn't think to look, not because of the radiation. I'd stopped getting sick from it, stopped feeling the burn in my lungs when I wandered too close to the hot zones. It was harder because I'd started to notice how people looked at me, the flinch when I got too close, the way mothers pulled their children behind them when I passed, the guards at the settlements who kept their hands on their weapons and their eyes on me even after I'd traded and left. I wasn't dangerous. I'd never hurt anyone. I was just trying to survive the same as everyone else. But I looked like something dangerous, and that was enough. I tried to keep to myself. I set up a routine: scavenge in the mornings, trade in the afternoons, hide at night. I avoided the larger settlements where the scrutiny was worse. I stuck to the edges, the forgotten places, the ruins where no one else wanted to be. I met others like me, ghouls. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We knew what we were. We knew what we'd lost. Some of them had been changed longer than me. Their skin was worse, falling apart in places, held together by what looked like willpower alone. They moved slowly, stiffly, like their joints had fused. Some of them had trouble remembering things, names, dates, what they'd been before. I told myself I'd never get that bad. I told myself a lot of things. The third year, I stopped looking in mirrors. It wasn't a conscious decision. I just realized one day that I'd been avoiding them, that I'd walk past reflective surfaces with my eyes turned away, that I'd cover anything that might show me my own face, because every time I saw myself, I saw less of the person I used to be. My hair was gone, my skin had thickened and cracked, developing patterns that looked like bark or old leather. My eyes had sunk deeper into my skull. My teeth had yellowed and loosened. I had to chew carefully or risk losing one. I was rotting from the outside in, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The worst part wasn't the physical changes. It was the way my mind stayed sharp. I remembered everything: Margie, the house, the coffee cup, the flash of light. I remembered what I used to look like, who I used to be, and I had to carry that memory around inside a body that looked like a corpse. Sometimes I wished I could forget. Sometimes I wished I'd go feral like some of the others, lose myself to the radiation and the hunger and whatever chemical process had turned us into this. But my mind stayed clear, and that was its own kind of punishment. In the fourth year, I tried to settle down. There was a town about 30 miles west, built around an old factory that still had power from a generator someone had jury-rigged. They had walls, guards, a market that ran every day. It looked like something close to civilization. I thought maybe I could stop running, find a place, make it work. I found a room above a shop that sold salvage tools. The owner was a ghoul, older than me, and he didn't ask questions when I offered caps for rent. I moved in with what little I had, and I told myself this could be home. It lasted 3 months. The problem wasn't the room, it wasn't the town, it was the people. The humans, smoothskins, some of the ghouls called them, though I hated that term too. They tolerated us. They let us trade, they let us live there, but tolerance isn't acceptance. They had their parts of town and we had ours. They had their shops and we had ours. And if you crossed that invisible line too often, if you forgot your place, someone would remind you. I got reminded when I tried to buy food at a smoothskin market. The woman behind the counter looked at me like I'd crawled out of the sewer. She took my caps, but she threw my change on the counter instead of handing it to me. When I reached for it, she stepped back. "Don't touch anything you're not buying," she said. I said, "I just want my change." She said, "Then pick it up and leave." I picked it up. I left. But I came back the next day because I needed food, and it was the only market in that part of town. The woman wasn't there. Her husband was. He saw me and his expression hardened. "We don't serve your kind anymore," he said. I said, I have caps. He said, I don't care. Get out. I left. I went to another shop. Same response. And another. And another. By the end of the week, I couldn't buy food anywhere on the smooth-skinned side of town. I asked the landlord what I'd done wrong. He sighed. You didn't do anything wrong. You're just... He gestured at me. You look the way you look. People don't like being reminded of what could happen to them. I said, I'm not contagious. He said, doesn't matter. Fear isn't logical. I moved out at the end of the month. The 5th year, I stopped trying to find a place. I became a drifter. I moved from settlement to settlement, never staying long enough to be noticed, never getting close enough to be remembered. I slept in ruins and abandoned buildings. I ate whatever I could scavenge. I avoided people when I could, and endured them when I couldn't. I learned the routes between the towns. I learned which settlements were safer for ghouls, and which ones barely tolerated us. I learned where the radiation was thick enough to glow in the dark, and where the water was clean enough to drink without boiling it first. I learned to live small, to take up as little space as possible, to speak quietly, to apologize even when I hadn't done anything wrong. Because being right didn't matter if being right got you killed. I saw ghouls get killed. Not often, but often enough. A ghoul accused of stealing in a settlement outside the old city limits. They beat him to death in the street, and no one stopped them. A ghoul who got too close to a smooth-skinned child. The father put a bullet in her head, and the guards ruled it self-defense. A ghoul who talked back to the wrong person in the wrong town. They tied him to a post and left him in the sun for 3 days. He was still alive when I passed through, but he wasn't talking anymore. I learned to keep my head down. I learned to survive. The 6th year, I started losing time. Not big chunks, just moments. I'd be walking and then I'd realize I didn't remember the last mile. I'd be sitting and then I'd notice the sun had moved and I didn't know where the hours had gone. It scared me more than anything else, because I'd seen what happened to ghouls who lost themselves. I'd seen them wandering in circles, muttering to nothing, attacking anything that moved. I'd seen them put down like animals because they'd stopped being people. I didn't want that. I started writing things down, where I'd been, where I was going, what day it was, little reminders to myself that I was still here, still thinking, still human even if I didn't look it anymore. It helped. Mostly, but there were still gaps, still moments when I'd come back to myself and realize I'd been somewhere else, doing something I didn't remember. I told myself it was just stress, exhaustion, hunger. I didn't let myself think about the alternative. In the 7th year, I met a smooth skin who didn't flinch. Her name was Anna. She ran a clinic in a settlement built into the remains of an old shopping complex. She treated everyone smoothskins. Ghouls, anyone who could pay or barter or beg. I came in with an infection in my hand. A cut that had gotten dirty, turned green, started to smell. I thought I'd lose the hand. I thought maybe I'd lose more. She cleaned it, drained it, wrapped it in clean bandages, and gave me antibiotics she'd salvaged from somewhere. She didn't charge me. When I asked why, she said, because you needed help. I came back a week later to return the bandages. She was treating a smooth-skinned child with a broken arm. She saw me and nodded and went back to her work. I left the bandages on the counter and walked out. But I came back, not for treatment, just to talk. She was the first person in years who didn't look at me like I was something to be scraped off her shoe. We talked about small things. The weather, the settlements, the state of the roads. She told me about the clinic, about the patients she'd lost, about the ones she'd saved. I told her about the places I'd been, the things I'd seen, the people I'd met. I didn't tell her about Margie, about the house, about the coffee cup. Some things were too heavy to share. She asked me once why I kept moving. I said, because staying puts a target on your back. She said, you ever think about fighting back? I said, against what? Fear, stupidity, you can't fight that, you just survive it. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. We didn't talk about it again. I stayed near that settlement for almost 6 months, longer than I'd stayed anywhere since the town that kicked me out. I helped Anna when she needed it, carrying supplies, fixing things that broke, keeping watch when she worked late. It felt like something close to normal. Then the raiders came. They hit the settlement at night. 40, maybe 50 of them, armed with guns and knives and makeshift explosives. They came for the supplies, for the food, for whatever they could take. The guards fought back. Some of the settlers fought back. It wasn't enough. I was at the clinic when it started. Anna was stitching up a man who'd cut himself on scrap metal. We heard the gunfire, and she looked at me and said, "Help me get the patients to the back." We moved them. 3 people, 2 of them barely able to walk. We got them into the storage room, and Anna barred the door, and we waited. The gunfire got closer, then it stopped. We waited longer. Then the door exploded inward. 2 raiders, young, maybe early 20s. They had guns, and they were smiling, and when they saw us they laughed. One of them pointed his gun at Anna and said, "Look what we found." I stepped between them. The raider looked at me, and his smile faltered. "Jesus, what the hell are you?" I didn't answer. He raised his gun. "Get out of the way, Ghoul." I said, "No." He shot me. The bullet hit me in the shoulder, and I staggered, but I didn't fall. He shot me again. Chest. I felt the impact, but it didn't hurt the way it should have. I kept moving forward. He backed up. "What the?" I hit him. Hard. Harder than I knew I could. He went down and didn't get up. The second raider raised his gun, and Anna hit him with a metal tray. He dropped the gun, and she hit him again, and he fell. We stood there, breathing hard, staring at the 2 bodies on the floor. Then Anna looked at me and saw the blood spreading across my shirt. "You're shot," she said. I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you go down?" I said, "I don't know." She pulled my shirt open and examined the wounds. The bullets had gone through. Clean holes, barely bleeding. "You heal fast," she said. I said, "I guess." She bandaged me anyway. The raiders left before dawn. They took what they could carry and burned the rest. The settlement was gutted. Half the buildings were ash. Most of the supplies were gone. Anna's clinic was still standing, but barely. She found me the next morning, sitting on the steps outside. "I'm leaving," she said. I said, "Where?" She said, "West. I heard there's a settlement out there that's better organized, better defended. I'm going to try to set up a clinic there." I nodded. She looked at me. "You saved my life." I said, "You saved mine first." She smiled. It was a sad smile. Then she said, "You could come with me." I thought about it. I thought about walking beside her, about helping her set up the new clinic, about having someone to talk to who didn't see me as a monster. But I also thought about the way the raider had looked at me, the fear in his eyes when I didn't go down. I was useful because I was hard to kill, but that same thing made me dangerous. And if I stayed with Anna, eventually someone would see me as a threat. To her, to the settlement, to whatever fragile piece they'd built. I said, "I can't." She nodded like she'd expected that. She left the next day. I watched her go, and I didn't follow. The 8th year, I went back to the ruins. Not the neighborhood where I used to live, I couldn't face that. But the cities, the dead places where the bombs had hit hardest, where the radiation was still thick enough to kill smoothskins in hours. I could walk through it without a suit. I could breathe the air without coughing. I could drink the water without dying. It was the one place I had an advantage. I scavenged the deep ruins, the places no one else could reach. I found tech, weapons, medicine, all the things the smoothskins needed but couldn't get themselves. I traded it in the settlements for caps and supplies, and I kept moving. I stopped trying to connect with people. It was easier that way. The 9th year, I started to notice the changes accelerating. My skin had stopped peeling. It had settled into a texture like old rubber, thick and tough and deeply creased. My hair was completely gone. My nails had thickened into something closer to claws. I looked less human every day, but I felt the same inside. That was the cruelty of it. My body was becoming a monster, but my mind stayed clear. I still remembered what it was like to be normal, to have skin that didn't crack, to be able to smile without feeling the tissue pulled tight across my face. I remembered Margie. I remembered the coffee cup. I remembered the flash of light. And I carried those memories through a world that had decided I wasn't worth remembering. The 10th year, I stopped counting. What was the point? The years blurred together. The seasons changed, but I didn't. I just kept going, kept surviving, kept enduring because stopping meant dying, and I was apparently too stubborn to die. I met other ghouls who'd been changed longer than me. Some of them had been around since the bombs fell, 200 years, give or take. They'd watched the world rebuild itself, and they were still here, still rotting, still enduring. I asked one of them how he did it. He looked at me with eyes that had gone cloudy and said, "You just do. What else is there?" I didn't have an answer. I kept moving. I kept scavenging. I kept surviving. The settlements changed. Some grew, some fell, some burned. I watched them rise and fall and rise again, and none of it touched me because I was just passing through. Always passing through. Never staying. Never belonging. I became a ghost in my own life. The Smoothskins saw me as a monster. The ghouls saw me as one of them, but we didn't connect. We didn't form communities. We just existed in the same spaces, parallel lines that never met. I was alone in a way that had nothing to do with proximity. You can be surrounded by people and still be utterly isolated. I learned that lesson over and over. In the 12th year, I found a settlement that was run by ghouls, not just tolerated. Run. The mayor was a ghoul. The guards were ghouls. The market was full of ghouls trading with each other, no Smoothskins in sight. It should have felt like home. It didn't, because we were all damaged, all scarred, all carrying the weight of decades or centuries of rejection and violence and quiet, grinding prejudice. We didn't trust each other any more than the Smoothskins trusted us. I stayed for a few weeks, then moved on. The 15th year, I stopped talking unless I had to. My voice had gotten worse, rougher. The words came out strangled and harsh, and people flinched when they heard it. So I stopped using it. I communicated with gestures when I could, with writing when I had to, with silence most of the time. It was easier. The 20th year, I realized I'd stopped aging. Not just the outward changes, those had plateaued years ago, but the internal ones. I didn't feel weaker. I didn't feel slower. My memory was still sharp. My reflexes were still quick. I was stuck, frozen in this state of decay, unable to heal but unable to die. I'd become the thing I'd feared most. Not a monster, just unchanging, eternal. A witness to a world that would outlive me even though I'd outlive everyone in it. The 25th year, I went back to the old neighborhood. I don't know why. Nostalgia, maybe, or morbid curiosity, or just the need to see if anything remained of the life I used to have. The houses were gone, most of them, anyway, collapsed or burned or scavenged down to the foundations. The streets were cracked and overgrown with whatever passed for vegetation in the irradiated soil. I found my house, or what was left of it. The roof had caved in. The walls were sagging. The porch where I'd sat and waited for someone to come and tell me what to do was rotted through. I went inside anyway. The kitchen was full of debris. The bathroom was a shell. The bedroom door was still closed. I didn't open it. I stood in the hallway, and I tried to remember what it had been like to live here. To wake up in the morning and make coffee and kiss Margie goodbye before she went to the store. But the memories felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. I left. I didn't go back. The 30th year, I stopped counting again. Not because I couldn't keep track, but because it didn't matter. 30 years. 40. 50. What difference did it make? I was still here. Still rotting. Still enduring. I'd outlived everyone I knew. Everyone who'd known me. Everyone who'd remembered the person I used to be. I was a stranger to myself. The world kept changing around me. Settlements rose and fell. Factions warred and made peace and warred again. Technology improved. People adapted. Life went on. And I kept walking. Scavenging. Trading. Surviving. I'd become a fixture. A constant. The ghoul who'd been around forever, who knew the roots and the ruins and the places where the radiation was thickest. People knew me by reputation but not by name. I didn't mind. Names were for people who had identities. I was just a body that refused to stop. I met a smooth skin once. This was maybe 40 years in, maybe 50. I'd lost track, who asked me what it was like to be a ghoul. I said, "You ever have a cut that won't heal? That just stays there, hurting, reminding you it's there every time you move?" She nodded. I said, "It's like that, except it's your whole body, and it never stops." She looked at me with something like pity. I walked away before she could say anything. I didn't need pity. I needed to keep moving. The years blurred together after that. 60, 70, 80. I stopped looking like anything recognizable. My skin had taken on a texture like dried mud, cracked and flaking in places. My face was a ruin of sagging tissue and exposed bone. My hands were claws, but my mind stayed sharp. That was the punishment. To be trapped in this body, to look like a corpse, to be treated like a monster, and to remember every second of what it was like to be human. I met other ghouls who'd lost themselves, who'd gone feral, who attacked anything that moved and had to be put down. I envied them. They didn't have to carry the weight of memory. They didn't have to endure the slow, grinding horror of consciousness inside a body that had given up everything except the ability to keep going. I kept going. The settlements changed again. New factions rose. Old ones fell. The world rebuilt itself in fits and starts, and I was there to watch it happen. Always watching. Never participating. I was a ghost. A relic. A thing that had survived long past its expiration date. I met a ghoul once. This was later, much later. I'd stopped counting at all by then, who told me he remembered the bombs falling. He said he'd been a soldier, that he'd seen the flash from a bunker and thought he was safe. He wasn't. None of us were. He said the worst part wasn't the transformation. It was the realization that he'd have to live with it. Not for years. For centuries. I understood. We sat in silence for a while, two corpses pretending to be people, and then he said, "You ever think about ending it?" I said, "Every day." He said, "But you don't." I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" I thought about it. I thought about all the reasons I'd kept going. Spite, stubbornness, fear, habit. But the real reason was simpler. I said, "Because I don't know how." He nodded. We didn't talk about it again. Somewhere past the 100-year mark, I stopped trying to track time at all. The world had moved on. The people who'd known the old world were mostly dead. The new generation had grown up in the ruins, and they didn't remember what it was like before. I did. I remembered cars that ran on gasoline. I remembered electricity that came from power plants instead of generators. I remembered a sky that was blue instead of gray. I remembered a world where people didn't flinch when they saw me. But that world was gone, and I was still here. I found a place in the deep ruins, an old subway station that had collapsed in on itself, creating a space that was sheltered and hidden and far enough from the settlements that no one bothered me. I made it mine. I lined the walls with the things I'd scavenged over the years. Tools, weapons, books I couldn't read anymore because my eyes had started to fail, trinkets that reminded me of the old world. I slept there when I was tired. I left when I needed supplies. I came back when I was done. It wasn't home, but it was mine, and that was enough. I stopped going to the settlements as much. The new generation of smoothskins were more tolerant, or maybe just more indifferent. They'd grown up around ghouls. We weren't a novelty anymore, we were just part of the landscape. But tolerance isn't acceptance, and I was tired of pretending it was. I stayed in the ruins. I survived. I endured. I met fewer people, saw fewer faces, heard fewer voices. The silence was easier. I didn't have to watch people flinch, didn't have to hear the disgust in their voices, didn't have to endure the weight of their fear. I was alone, and alone was safer. My body kept changing. Slowly. So slowly I barely noticed. My skin had started to harden in places, forming plates that felt more like stone than flesh. My joints had stiffened. I moved more carefully now, more deliberately, because sudden movements sent pain lancing through me. But I didn't die. I never died. I met a ghoul once, this was recent, or maybe it was decades ago. Time has no meaning anymore, who told me she'd been alive for over 200 years. She said she didn't remember what she used to look like. She said she didn't remember her name. She said she stayed in the ruins because there was nowhere else to go. I understood. We're not people anymore. We're echoes, remnants of a world that ended a lifetime ago. We're the things that survived when we shouldn't have. And we keep going because stopping isn't an option. I think about Margie sometimes. Not as often as I used to. The memories have worn down over the years, smoothed out by time until they're more feeling than image. I remember the shape of her face, but not the details. I remember the sound of her voice, but not the words. I remember that I loved her, but I don't remember what that felt like. The radiation took my body. Time took everything else. I'm still here, still walking, still scavenging, still enduring. I don't know why. I don't know what I'm enduring for, but I keep going, because that's what ghouls do. We survive, not because we want to, not because we have a choice, but because we've forgotten how to stop. I found a mirror in the ruins a few days ago, or maybe it was a few months ago, or years. It doesn't matter. I looked into it. The face that looked back was barely recognizable as a face, more skull than skin, more ruin than person. But the eyes were still mine, clouded, yellowed, sunken deep into the skull. But mine. I'm still in here, somewhere, buried under layers of rot and radiation and time. I'm still in here, and I don't know if that's a mercy or a curse. I walked away from the mirror. I left it in the ruins. I don't need reminders of what I've become. I live with it every second of every day. The weight of this body, the weight of this existence, the weight of surviving when dying would have been kinder. I keep walking, not toward anything, not away from anything, just walking, because that's all that's left. The world keeps turning, the settlements keep growing, the smoothskins keep rebuilding, and I keep walking through the spaces in between, a ghost in a world that's moved on without me. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I'd died that first week, if the fever had taken me, if the radiation had been just a little stronger, if I'd given up instead of enduring. Would it have been better? Would Margie have been waiting for me? Or is this all there is? This endless stretch of days and nights and years, blurring together into a grey nothing that doesn't end because I can't make it end. I don't have answers. I just have questions. And time. So much time. Too much time. I met a smooth-skinned child yesterday, or maybe it was last year. Time slips. She looked at me and didn't flinch. She asked me if I was a monster. I said, I don't know. She said, you look scary. I said, I know. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, does it hurt? I said, every day. She nodded like that made sense. Then her mother called her and she ran off, and I was alone again. I keep thinking about that question. Does it hurt? Yes. Every day, every hour. Every second, but not in the way she meant. The body doesn't hurt. It's numb, dead, beyond pain. It's the mind that hurts. The weight of memory. The weight of awareness. The weight of being trapped inside a corpse that won't die. That's what hurts. And there's no medicine for that. No bandage. No cure. Just endurance. I'm tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that goes bone deep, soul deep. The kind that comes from living too long in a world that doesn't want you. But I keep going, because I don't know how to stop. Because stopping feels like surrender. Because maybe, somewhere deep down, I still hope that it gets better. It won't. I know that. But hope is a stubborn thing. Even when it's irrational. Even when it's stupid. Even when it's the only thing left. I'm walking again. Through the ruins. Through the ash. Through the silence. Just walking. Because that's what I do. That's what ghouls do. We endure. We survive. We keep going long after we should have stopped. And maybe that's all survival is. Not living. Just refusing to die. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if there's an end to this. I don't know if I'll eventually go feral, lose myself, become the monster everyone already thinks I am. Or if I'll just keep walking forever. A corpse pretending to be alive. A ghost haunting a world that's already forgotten me. I keep walking, one foot in front of the other. Through the wasteland. Through the years. Through the endless, grinding weight of existence. I keep walking. Because I've forgotten how to stop. Because this is all I have left. Because I'm still here. And I don't know what else to do.